Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much, Dr. Naveed, for that generous introduction. I don't know if I can really stand in Sheikh Didat's shoes. In fact, the fact is that with the passing away of the scholars of Islam, we lose gems that are irreplaceable. Everyone has something to offer, and we have to definitely offer what we can, but we cannot pretend that we will replace those who have passed away. Anyhow, I join you in making dua for our Shaykh. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward him for all of his good works and overlook any shortcomings. And I'm sure that many of you here today, by attending these workshops, by learning about how to give dawah, will continue the great legacy that he has left behind. Now, to our topic here, let's deal with relativism. I will deal with that very quickly because, in fact, we can deal with it in a summary form and then move on. Relativism is not relativity. Relativity is Einstein's theory about how things depend on the position of the observer. But relativism is an idea that is somehow related to that, and it is the idea that there is no absolute truth. Nothing is really true in and of itself. Things are just simply true for you. So you may say that Islam is great. Well, that's great for you. But someone else may think that Christianity is great, or atheism is great, or whatever. People have particular vantage points, and from those vantage points things look good or bad. And nothing is really in and of itself either good or bad, true or false. Well, we can deal with that in a summary form. And I can borrow an idea that was put forward by Michael Poole in an excellent book entitled Science and Belief. This book was published in your country. Michael Poole, at the time of writing at least, was lecturer in science education at King's College, London. Science and Belief. What Poole says is that the idea of relativism itself has to be false, because if relativism is true, in that nothing really is true, then relativism itself is not a true position. You see? And in that case it recoils on itself. We can add to that furthermore that there are some things which seem to be universally true. Like, for example, the idea that it is wrong to torture a child just for fun. I think most people will agree that that is a true statement, that it is wrong to torture a child just for fun. And if that is so, well, then the idea of relativism is false. It can be true to a certain extent, that yes, we do have vantage points. Things look good to people depending on where they stand. So we can say to a certain extent that things depend on your vantage point, but on the other hand, there are some things which are true in and of themselves, and where you stand is not going to change the fact of what is being observed. So I will just leave it at that. Any questions regarding that particular point about the relativism and how to respond to that? Yes. Relativism is the idea that there is no absolute truth, that nothing is true in and of itself, but that things are true for individuals depending on their particular vantage points. So from where you stand, something looks good or bad, or true or false, depending on your training, your experience. If you were born in Saudi Arabia, you probably are a Muslim, and that's good for you. If you were born in Rome, you probably are a Christian, and that's good for you. It looks good to you from where you stand. But we can say, even if it looks good to a person, depending on his or her vantage point initially, there is something more to be studied, to be investigated, and eventually there is a truth that could be found. Yes, sister? I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you very well. This I don't know, but it seems to me that it's part of a pool of ideas that come out of the European Enlightenment within the last 300 years. Of course, Einstein's theory of relativity is more recent, but the ideas are connected. But relativism as a concept did not necessarily come after Einstein's theory of relativity. Can we move on then from this? Okay, I want to talk about the use of logic in general. Now, the topic is the use of logic in Dawah, but in fact, logic is universal and does not really depend on giving Dawah. In fact, if you were to just pick up a college textbook on how to write a good essay, you will find a discussion of logic, because in fact, you couldn't write a good essay unless you know some of the rudiments of logic. Well, actually, everyone knows the rudiments of logic, at least informally, because we use it all the time. In fact, even little kids know the rudiments of logic, and they use that too. We will get more into detail, but just very quickly, if you contradict yourself, if you promise two different things, kids will notice that and will say, well, how is it that 2 weeks ago you promised me that and now you promised me the other thing? They're noticing a contradiction, and they are here building on the universal law of non-contradiction. In other words, we all recognize that people shouldn't contradict themselves. You shouldn't say one thing and then say the opposite thing to that. You cannot accept two contradictory things. So you can note that you can note that down in your papers, wherever you have your notes. The law of non-contradiction. Law of non-contradiction. That is a law known in logic. Law of non-contradiction. Now, if you are writing an essay, or you are, more to our point here, if you are discussing ideas with people, and if you can mention a logical law, if you can mention the name of it, it just gives more force to what you're saying. It's just the thing about language. You know, if you name a disease by a certain Latin name, suddenly the disease sounds so much more terrible, right? And in a similar way, in fact, if you are just simply expressing a point, but you name the rule based on which you're constructing your claim, your claim seems to be so much more powerful. It's the same claim, but it just seems to have so much more force. So there you go, the law of non-contradiction. So in short then, we all know the use of logic. In fact, our brains are so structured that we couldn't work without logic. But logic can also be studied formally. Now, at the university level, usually they offer two kinds of logic courses. One is called formal logic, and the other is called informal logic. Now, formal logic is like mathematics, or at least it seems to proceed along similar sorts of lines. You use symbols to represent thoughts, and then you show how symbols relate to each other. In other words, how the thoughts relate to each other by the use of symbols. In that case, you can use very complex interconnecting ideas and represent them by symbols. We won't be going down that route, but we'll go down the other route, which is generally referred to as critical thinking. Critical thinking. It is called at the university level also informal logic. So you have formal logic and you have informal. We're going to do with informal. And informal logic has to do with just everyday arguments. The things that you may find, for example, expressed in the letters to the editor in a daily paper. Somebody there is constructing an argument. Somebody is saying, look, I stand for this, or I disagree with that. And they're giving an argument there. They're telling you the reasons why they agree or disagree. And some of the reasons are logical, reasonable, sensible. Some of them are hilarious. Whatever, you will have your own judgments about that. But how do you deconstruct these arguments? Now, I want to see how we might spot certain fallacies in thinking. And again, if you are discussing something with someone and you can name the fallacy that they have committed, again, you have great persuasive force in what you're saying. You can say to someone, you have just committed the genetic fallacy. Now, they may not know what this is initially, but what you're saying seems to have force because you seem to know what you're talking about. That does not mean that you should use jargon all of the time just to befuddle your opponent, but knowing the use of logic, knowing critical thinking, and knowing how to deconstruct arguments will in fact work for you. So here we have just named a fallacy the genetic fallacy. What does that refer to? Genetic fallacy is committed when someone classifies an idea based on where it comes from. So someone says, for example, you shouldn't believe in God because that's just simply what you were taught by your parents. So that says that idea comes from your parents. Things which come from parents are bad, therefore you shouldn't believe in what comes from parents. That's called a genetic fallacy. They're saying that the idea is wrong because of where it comes from. Of course, the idea could be good, even though it is taught by parents. Okay, not everything that parents teach you are bad. In fact, most of what parents teach you are good. But even if it were the case that most of what they teach you is bad, it is still possible that this one thing that they have taught you is good. So the genetic fallacy says you should reject an idea because of where the idea comes from. The origin of the idea decides its worth. Glad to see we have such distinguished persons with us as Brother Dawood. In fact, he should be here and I should be there listening. But we'll have a chance to do that later on, I'm sure, inshallah. Alright, so genetic fallacy. So if someone says to you, no, you shouldn't believe in God because, people were taught so. Because they feared the afterlife, or they feared the unknown, and they invented this idea of God. They're committing the genetic fallacy. They're saying that the idea came as a result of fear. But the fact that the idea came as a result of fear, if that were true, does not mean that the idea itself is false. Because God may still exist, even if people believed in Him for the wrong reasons. See? So they committed genetic fallacy. And if you can name the game immediately, say that you're committing the genetic fallacy, well then, that just simply topples them off of their position of comfort. So the genetic fallacy. Another fallacy that is very common is called ad hominem, and it's related to this. The ad hominem fallacy. And this is Latin meaning against the man. Against the man. And one commits this fallacy when one, in order to discount an idea, says that it's the wrong person that said this. Basically. I mean, usually people don't put it that way, but that's what it amounts to. You say, we shouldn't believe that idea because that comes from such and such a person. The idea may be still true, even though it comes from even the worst guy. In fact, we know from a hadith that even shaitan tells the truth sometimes, right? So, even though he's the wrong person to tell it, what he is saying might in fact be true. So you cannot just simply discount an idea by pointing to the faults of the speaker. And I say, I don't have to listen to you, or I shouldn't be listening to you. You can say, well, what I'm saying might still be true, even though you don't have much reason to listen to me, yes.
How does that fit in with the compilation of hadith, where the source came from the person?
Yes, the question is, how do we reconcile this with the idea of hadith? Well, in hadith compilations, it was necessary in the history of this compilation to rely on people who were known, and in fact, of course, they were using this classification, and they were using jar and ta'dil, right? Accepting from some, impugning others, and so on. So this is how it was collected. It doesn't mean that's the end of all hadith studies. Okay, if we, not having the need for that, resorted to it, we'll be committing the same fallacy. We'd be saying we cannot listen to certain individuals because they come from certain schools. Well, they did what was necessary given the circumstances at the time. It's almost like reporters going to people of authority or going to people who are known to be scholars in the field. If someone is composing a documentary, for example, they wouldn't just speak to anyone to get the information. They would speak to professors at some of the local universities, for example. So in different fields, depending on what you're doing at the time, you will resort to different techniques. But as a concept here related to the idea of argumentation or presenting ideas, the ad hominem fallacy is committed when someone says, no, the idea is wrong because of who says it. Now that's a different thing. We might say the information is unreliable if it doesn't come from a reliable source. Okay? And we know the reliable sources and the unreliable sources. And we have ways of distinguishing between the two. So that's two different things. The reliability of information and the correctness of ideas. So the ad hominem fallacy is committed also when someone, instead of responding to the idea that you have presented, starts to attack you personally. Says, what could you know? Well, it doesn't matter what I could know. Here's my idea. How do you deal with this idea? You have to show that the idea itself is wrong. Don't show that I am wrong. Now, related to the ad hominem fallacy is the idea that is well, enough of Latin names. I mean, tu quoque would be that, but I can put it in English and say you too. You too. So, related to the ad hominem fallacy is this idea of saying you too. You have that problem too, or you have a bigger problem. So if you say, look, you have a problem there, someone said, but you too, you have the same problem. Well, that means he's admitting that he has the problem, in a way. Okay? Or at least he's not defending against the suggestion that he has that problem. So that does not really solve it. Or you can say to that, related to that, is two wrongs. It's just like Mama used to say, two wrongs do not make a right. Okay, so if I say you're wrong and you say I'm wrong, well, that doesn't mean that anybody is right here. Okay, you're still not right. So two wrongs do not make a right. So if you just name the argument, forget the Latin names, and you say, okay, that's the you too argument, that doesn't work. If you say that's the two wrongs argument, that doesn't work as well. To say that there are two wrongs. Now, related to this as well is the idea that, you should accept this. So this is an argument specially tailor-made for you. Now, some of these by themselves are not fallacies as they are, but only fallacies in specific situations. It will be a fallacy if instead of presenting ideas, you start attacking the person. But if you, as Nicholas Capaldi, who has taught critical thinking in the United States of America, says, if you are, for example, demolishing the idea and then, as icing on the cake, you then explain why this person has this sort of incorrect idea, well, then you are in fact wrapping it up all nicely. Okay, so you have to first be willing to demolish the idea. You can say, for example, this idea is wrong for this, and this reason. You've given all the reasons. And that's done. You could have actually ended there. But people might still be wondering, okay, but how did this guy get this idea? Alright, he presented the idea, and you came and said this idea is wrong for this, and this reason. So how did that other guy get this idea, the wrong idea? Then you can say, okay, he gets this idea because he studied in the school of wrong ideas. Okay, so then you put the icing on the cake there, you wrap it up all nicely, you make everyone satisfied, they know everything now and how it all fits together. So in a similar way, there is a certain ad hominem argument which says you should believe this. Of all people, you should know this. So this is again directed at a certain person, and in that sense it is ad hominem, directed at the person. But in a certain situation it can work. For example, you cannot settle everything starting from scratch, going all the way to the end. But you're dealing with people who have certain ideas already. For example, if you're speaking to a Christian, the Christian should not burden you with the responsibility of proving that God exists, because that would have been necessary if you're speaking to an atheist. True? And yet sometimes the same thing happens in a more subtle way. A Christian speaks to you, for example, and pretends that there is no such thing as revelation coming to a human being. So he wants you to prove that such a thing as revelation comes to a human being, in the case of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Whereas in fact, he or she has already accepted that revelation has come to prophets in the past. So between you and such a person who has accepted this as a phenomenon, this is no contest. That's where we begin. Revelation comes to individuals over time. So if you're asking about how do we know that Muhammad ﷺ was a genuine recipient of revelation, we should also be willing to extend that question to all of the prophets. How do you know that Moses was a genuine recipient of revelation? Or even Jesus, for that matter. And if you think that Muhammad ﷺ copied biblical ideas into the Quran and then offered that as a revelation from God, why don't we extend that question and ask, how do you know that Isa ﷺ did not do the same? See? So, in that case, my saying to him, you should know this, is valid. Is valid. It does not settle the truth of the question generally, because one who does not subscribe to that belief would still want me to prove that such a thing as revelation can occur. So it doesn't prove the point generally, but it should prove the point for the person who already accepts that as a phenomenon. Alright? So one has to now know when to use these arguments. Now, let's look at some others. Something that is often committed is what is called hasty generalization. Hasty generalization. That is committed when someone with insufficient evidence, without enough statistical samples, claims a certain result. So I come to the United Kingdom, the first person I meet is blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and I then conclude that, okay, people of the United Kingdom are all blonde-haired and blue-eyed. That's called hasty generalization. We cannot make such a generalization without a properly representative sample. And of course that takes us into the idea of compiling statistics on the whole. We should recognize how statistics are being used and how they can be misused. Someone said that there are lies, there are damn lies, and then there are statistics. Statistics sometimes can be skewed depending on how you take a survey. For example, if you survey people who are logging on to the internet, if you do an internet survey, then of course you're getting people who are generally logging on to the internet. So if your survey question is the internet a good thing to use? Of course, most likely you get the answer yes. And then you can say, well, everyone says that using the internet is a good thing, because we asked 1,000 people and they all responded positively. Of course, you didn't ask people who do not like to use the internet, because naturally your question was posed through the internet, and you're getting the people who would normally use the internet anyhow. Yes? Stereotyping, yes, is a form of hasty generalization in that you're saying that everyone of a certain description would fit the same pattern or behave in the same way or have the same beliefs. That's stereotyping. It's a kind of hasty generalization. You have known perhaps one person or two persons or some people who are of that sort and have these beliefs, and you believe that everyone of the same sort will have the same sorts of beliefs. Right? Hasty generalization. So watch for the sampling. And then if you talk about the use of statistics in general and the way in which it's being misused, you see it all the time in advertisements and so on. So you should know how to deconstruct them. You may already have a sixth sense about this, but it's beneficial sometimes to be able to pin down what exactly is happening here. Now, someone says everyone is using this product. Well, how do you know everyone is using this product? Because we made a survey, and the survey shows that everyone is using the product. Well, how did you conduct this survey? In the world of ideas, sometimes people say, it is generally agreed. It is generally agreed. Well, how do you know it's generally agreed? How many people did you survey to find out it's generally agreed? Usually when someone's circle of friends seem to have the same idea, a person imagines that the thing is generally agreed. In fact, Muslim scholars have made this mistake at times too, because they have claimed that a certain thing is generally agreed, whereas what they really meant is that the scholars that they are familiar with agree on the same thing. Sometimes people have claimed that there is a consensus on a certain point, and what he really means is that he's not familiar with a scholar who has said anything to the contrary. And sometimes people have claimed that there's a consensus on X, and others have claimed that there's a consensus on not X as well. So one has to watch for that. Okay, so it can happen to anyone. People can imagine that no one disagrees with what he or she is saying. They think everybody has the same idea. Now, there is a fallacy that is known as the fallacy of composition. Fallacy of composition. That is when a person attributes the quality of the whole, the quality of the part to the whole. So someone says that a certain individual is timid, so if a group of these individuals come together, they will be likewise timid. Alright, that's called a fallacy of composition. It is not true necessarily that if the group of individuals come together, they may be timid. An individual by himself or herself might be timid, but a group of them together may actually acquire new strength and new courage that was not there in the individual. So you cannot say that the quality of the individual is the quality of the whole. Mm-hmm.
So would this fit in with Muslims generally, where some Muslims behave in a certain way, and people in a sense say, therefore all Muslims are like that?
Yeah, I would tend to put that in hasty generalization. Going from the idea of one Muslim all the way to to categorize all Muslim, that would be more like stereotyping. But it fits here as well. That you can say that one Muslim by himself is not an activist, but if you put a group of them together, they will be active. Okay, that's more like the idea of composition. Of course, that is a true example. But if one says no, because one Muslim by himself is lazy, if you put a group of Muslims together, they will be lazy. That's committing the fallacy of composition. Now, the reverse of that is the fallacy of division, where one imagines that the quality of the group or the quality of the whole is there present in the parts. It may not be true. An airplane can fly, but that doesn't mean that any one of its individual parts could fly. Alright, so that's the opposite fallacy of division. And again, the point of naming these, even though we know about these logical points, is that when you know the name, and you can name it, you can say to a person, you just realize you've committed the fallacy of division. Say, what? Now, of course, you have to explain to him what the fallacy of division is. And if you can do that, of course, you have disarmed him. Because now you made him worry that if he says something next, you're going to name another fallacy. And he's not really prepared for that. Now, a lot of fallacies are caused by people are committed when people mistake causation. Now, causation by itself is not a fallacy, but I'll write that down. Causation. Causation just simply is the idea of what causes what, right? Recognizing causes and effects. And people all make a lot of mistakes regarding this. One of the mistakes they make, that is a fallacy, is good to know the name of. It's called post hoc. Post hoc, H-O-C. Post hoc. The post hoc fallacy is committed when someone says that something happened after that thing, and therefore it is caused by that thing. Well, they're mistaking cause and effect by saying after this. Post hoc really means after this, therefore because of this. After this, therefore because of this. Now if we have two clocks on the wall, one is programmed to alarm at 10 o'clock and the other one is programmed to alarm at 10:01. So every time this goes off, the next minute you will see that one going off. So does it mean that this one caused that one to go off? No. Each one is operating independently, they're just set differently. But one who observes this pattern will say, every time this one goes off, that one goes off. So this one causes that one to go off. See? Now, concluding that this causes that is committing this fallacy here. Post hoc, saying it happens after that and therefore it's caused by that. Now this is why you will notice in journalistic writing that often they will put things in this way to avoid the post hoc fallacy. They will say, police have arrested 3 men after last night's robbery. So they're saying there was a robbery and 3 men have been arrested, but they're not saying that this is connected to that. You will form the connection, but they haven't said it. Okay, so they're avoiding the post hoc fallacy because they don't have all of the facts, they don't want to commit themselves, and so on. So causation sometimes gets tricky. Because just like the two clocks were operating independently, things may be happening independently but may appear to be connected. Let's say a person is a heavy smoker and also eating a lot. So a person is obese and also developing lung cancer. So you might say, okay, whenever a person has lung cancer, he also is obese, and there's a connection between obesity and lung cancer. It may not be so. That might be the observed phenomenon. You're observing that the person has obesity and lung cancer at the same time, and you're wondering what's the connection between the two. The connection may actually be something else. It may be boredom in life, for example. So boredom in life causes a person to smoke and he gets lung cancer, and the same boredom in life causes a person to eat a lot because he has nothing else to do, and that causes obesity. See, so the cause may actually be something else that is unrelated to the two things, and one has to be careful before saying that the correlation is the same as causation. So two things may be correlated to each other, but not necessarily so that one of them is caused by the other. Now, an interesting little book that deals with our subject is a book by Anthony Weston. I actually bought it in Norwich. I think I was a few months back. It was at a used book shop. I think I just paid £1 for it. It was quite a deal. A Rule Book for Arguments, it's called. A Rule Book for Arguments. Anthony Weston. But you don't have to get necessarily this book. There are several books that deal with the question of how to avoid the fallacies that people commonly commit. Now, in dealing with causation, then, we should be careful to know how causative arguments are constructed. One sort of argument is called modus ponens. Now you don't have to memorize this all at once, but make a note of it and look back at your notes in a month's time, and you will know it. It's not so difficult, really. Modus ponens, Ponens, and that form of argument says, in a nutshell, that suppose we say, let's take for granted that if A occurs, then B occurs. Now we call that in argument a premise. A premise. Premise. I forget now. Is it spelled M-I-S-E or M-I-S-S? M-I-S-E, isn't it? Okay. Premise. So we have that as a premise. We say, okay, let's accept, for argument's sake, as people say, let's accept for the sake of argument that if A is a fact, then B is definitely a fact. Or, to put it another way, if A occurs, then B will occur. Or, whenever A happens, B happens. Whenever A is the case, B is the case. So we can say then, for example, whenever it rains, the streets are wet. Okay, whenever it rains, the streets are wet. I think we can all accept that as a fact, right? Whenever it rains, the streets are wet. So the modus ponens argument says that by conclusion, we can say that if we accept as another premise that A is true, we accept that A is true, we should be all willing to accept that B is also true. Alright? So if we add the second premise A, then we should reach B by conclusion. And no one should deny that conclusion. If they do, then something is really wrong up there. Okay? Because we have said, let's agree that if A is the case, then B definitely is the case. And let's also agree that A is the case. Well then, we should all agree that B definitely is the case. Alright? If we translate that into English prose, if it rains, then the streets are wet. It rains. Therefore, the streets are wet. Okay? Now, I've put it in this form in order to illustrate a fallacy that is connected with this. A fallacy is to deny the consequent. To deny the consequent. That's called denial of the consequent. So you have A being the initial cause, the antecedent, and then you have B being the result, the consequent. So you say if it rains, that's the antecedent, right? That's the cause of something. And then B is the result, the streets get wet. That's the consequent. Alright? So we've already seen that if you say if it rains, then the streets are wet. If it rains, then therefore the streets are wet. You cannot turn around and say, but wait a minute, the streets are not wet, and therefore it didn't rain. Am I confusing myself here? Wait a minute. No, this denial of the consequent is in another page, which I will get to in a minute. What we need to say here is the affirming of the consequent. So I'm going to change that. Affirming. Affirming the consequent. So the consequent here is B, right? The streets are wet. So you cannot say, okay, so the streets are wet, and therefore it did rain. Because the streets might be wet for a different reason. Maybe someone was washing a car, perhaps the street washer went by and washed all of the streets. So the streets are wet, but that doesn't mean that it rained. So in modus ponens then, you can affirm the antecedent, the one that comes before, the cause of something. You can say that's the cause, and we agree that when that cause occurs, well, this result will occur. The cause has occurred, therefore the result is definite. I don't have to check to see if the result has happened, because we accept as a matter of principle that whenever that cause occurs, the consequent will follow. But you cannot turn it around and say that the consequent followed, therefore that cause has occurred, because that consequent could occur maybe for a number of different causes. Alright? So it's like mom saying, if you go out without your jumper, you'll catch a cold. So you went out, you caught a cold, and your mom says, well, you see, I told you, you go out without your jumper, you catch a cold. And you say, but mom, I did go out with my jumper. So you caught a cold for some other reason. See? So you cannot say that, you cannot affirm the consequent and say, okay, you caught a cold, and therefore it's because you went without your jumper. Yes?
Does this fit into a Dawah situation?
Well, in a Dawah situation, all of this fits, because in a more general way, once you understand how thinking occurs and how fallacies occur, first of all, your own mind becomes sharper. And all of your presentations become more logical, because you spot these things before you present them, so you don't commit these mistakes to begin with. And second, if someone were to commit such a mistake, you'd be able to spot it right away and to identify it. Now, I cannot think of a specific example, which would have been nice in response to you, a specific example where people commit this in presenting ideas. But you can see, as simple as the mom saying, okay, you caught a cold because you didn't wear your jumper. That shows how common it can be, as common as the common cold. Okay, it's a very common sort of mistake. Okay, the other part of it, or the flip side of this, is what is called modus tollens. So we have the same initial word, modus, right? And you know that word already from modus operandi and so on, modus. And this is tollens. They even rhyme, so it's easy to remember. And this says now that if A occurs, then B will occur. We're at the same place, right? We're saying that if A occurs, then B definitely will occur. So now, if B did not occur, if B did not occur, if it is not the case that B occurred, then we should conclude that A also did not occur. That's where I confused myself, because I was trying to see if what I was saying was making sense, and it wasn't when I was saying about denying the consequent. Okay? So on the previous page, what we were saying, in this form of argument, you're saying if this occurs, then this definitely occurs. We agree on that as a matter of principle. Then we say, okay, so this occurred, then naturally we have to admit that that occurred as well. Okay? If we say the first guy that comes in here is a murderer. So, I mean, it's a surprising statement, but then if we can accept anything as a matter of principle, as you say, for the sake of argument, right? But if we accept for the sake of argument that the first guy who comes in here is a murderer, well then, let's say Sammy comes in. We have to say, okay, Sammy is a murderer. Right? If we're not going to accept that Sammy is a murderer, we have to go back and revise and say, no, we shouldn't accept such silly things as saying the first guy who comes in here is a murderer. All right? So the point in argumentation, then, in deductive logic, is that once you accept the premises, once you accept something for the sake of argument, you have to accept what follows from it. All right? If you in mathematics, you're doing this all of the time. If you accept that I have 2 pennies in one pocket, and I have 2 pennies in the other pocket, I have to accept that I have at least 4 pennies. True? Because 2 plus 2 equals 4. So once you accept this, and you accept this, then you have to accept this. And we said that if you affirm the consequent, and then try to go back to the antecedent, you're making a mistake. In this form, we're saying now that if we accept as a matter of principle that if A occurs, then B definitely occurs, and then we accept that B did not occur, then we should accept also that A did not occur. Therefore, it is A did not occur. That's what I meant to say there. So now, to use our street being wet example, if we say that whenever it rains, the streets are wet, right? So that means if it rained 5 minutes ago, then the street should be wet. If it rained a minute ago, the street should be wet right now. So whenever it rains, if it rained yesterday, the streets were wet yesterday. If it rains tomorrow, the streets will be wet tomorrow. We're admitting as a general principle, when it rains, the streets are wet. So now, if we go out and we see that the streets are not wet, we should conclude it didn't rain. True? We don't have to ask anyone, did it rain? Like, nobody goes out and see the streets are dry and says, did it rain? Okay? See, we already know that, we know this logic, but we just haven't named it like this. But naming it just brings it more into sharp focus. It means then that whenever we say that this did not occur, we should conclude that this also did not occur. True? So now, in this form then, you should not then do what is called denying the antecedent. Denying the antecedent. That is a fallacy. Denying the antecedent in this case will mean to say that you are claiming that it didn't rain, and therefore the streets could not be wet. But we covered that before, right? You can say the streets are not wet, therefore it didn't rain. But you can't say it didn't rain, and therefore the streets are not wet, because the streets might still be wet even if it didn't rain. Right? You might catch that cold even if you did wear your jumper. Yes? In a way, yes. To deny the antecedent actually means that you are putting all your eggs in that one cause. You're saying that's the only cause. So if that didn't occur, the result couldn't occur. You're pretending that that's the only cause of the result that you have in mind. So to say that A causes B, to put it simply, doesn't mean that A is the only cause of B. Something else may also cause B. I mean, okay, let's say B is death. Okay, you can say drinking poison causes death, being shot causes death, so many different things. Being drowned causes death, and so on and so forth. Okay, so if a person drowns, he dies. That's a matter of principle. Okay, so if you cannot say he didn't drown, therefore he didn't die, because he might have been shot, or he might have drank poison, and so on and so forth. Okay. I know it sounds a little bit confusing initially, but if you have your notes and you think about it later on, and as you discuss with people and you come back to this and think about it some more, you will see how it all fits in and makes sense of everyday situations. And when you speak to people and you can actually name this, you can say according to the rule known as modus ponens, or according to the rule known as modus tollens, what you're saying is wrong. And he says, well, what is that? And now you tell him. Okay? And if that seems a little bit far out of reach, remember where we started, when we said if you can tell somebody according to the law of non-contradiction what you're saying is wrong, that seems much more powerful than if you just simply said, you're telling me two different things. You're saying the same thing, but just like the doctor prescribes something for you and says, you've got this disease, and he names it in Latin, makes it sound so much more terrible. The same thing happens here. So I found that in debate and dialogue, when I've been able to name a certain fault in the opponent's presentation, it just has much more weight. Yes?
What about like you say, A could possibly go B, but B must definitely go
Now, you see, now it depends always. It always depends on what premises you're starting out with. So, in logic in general, and in arguments as well, it all depends on what you're starting out with, as a matter of principle, or what's generally agreed between you, or so on, or as you would say in logic, in the accepted premises. All right. So if we accept, as a matter of principle, that if A occurs, then B definitely occurs, then that's our principle, and that's simple enough. If A occurs, then B occurs. If someone says, okay, if you give me $5, I'll give you, the whatever. If you give me $5, I'll buy you dinner. Then you give me $5 and I'll have to buy you dinner. It all follows, right? I mean, if A, then B. A occurred, then B has to occur. If you give me $5, I'll buy you dinner. You give me the $5, I have to buy you dinner. It's just so simple. Okay? So now, the A is you give me $5. The B is I buy you dinner. So if you give me the $5, I have to buy you dinner. It must follow. Now, if I buy you dinner, that doesn't mean that you gave me the $5 though. True? So I cannot say that because I bought you dinner, that means you gave me the $5. I mean, it's owing, but that doesn't mean you gave me. Okay? So whenever you give me $5, I buy you dinner. But if I bought you dinner, that doesn't mean you give me the $5. So I cannot affirm the consequent by saying, okay, that's okay. Nor can I deny the antecedent. I cannot say, okay, because you didn't give me $5, I didn't buy you dinner. I may have bought you the dinner anyhow. True? Okay. It gets tricky once we translate it, because when we translate it, we start involving tenses. Like we say, did and so on. But when we lay it out logically like this, we ignore all tenses. We only say, if A is the case, then B is the case. A is the case, therefore B is the case. And we say then that you cannot affirm the consequent. You cannot say B is the case and therefore A is the case. You can only say A is the case, therefore B is the case. But you cannot go the other way around. But you can go the other way around negatively. You can say, if A is the case, then B is the case. But B is not the case. And therefore, don't tell me that A is the case. Sorry, don't tell me. Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. So, see how tricky it gets. So, just to be sure again. So once we agree that if A is the case, B is the case, right? Then, if it's clear that B is not the case, then no one should try to convince me that A is the case, right? You see? Yes. Yes. Yes, it's all a matter of negotiating in the discussion itself. You see where they're coming from, you see where they're at. If you're able to think in this way, and you can think clearly, then it helps you overall. Because no matter where they come from, you're thinking clearly about what they're saying and how to refute them. And in some cases, you will find that what they're saying exactly fits the patterns. Just like I've put it to you, if you tell me if this occurs, if this is the case, then that is the case. But if that is not the case, then don't tell me that this is the case. You tell me that Jesus died for my sins. That means obviously my sins are paid for. So don't tell me that I still have to pay for my sins, because that means my sins are not paid for. You see, one way or another, it always comes back to properly laid out ways of thinking about it. And sometimes people are arguing with each other, and they're not making sense to each other because no one has bothered actually to put it in such a clear, logical format. And if you do, it works and it hits home. Like I can remember the debate I had with our good friend Jay Smith in Atlanta, when we were sitting on the couches together and we were discussing certain points, and he was saying that God died for our sins, and I asked him, on the cross, was Jesus dying as God or as man? And he said, no, he was dying as man. So then if he was dying as man, then he wasn't dying as God. Then therefore God did not die for our sins. So you should stop saying that God died for our sins, and so on. So once you put it clearly, logically, then things start to fall in place in favor for you. Now I'm afraid that he was speechless at that point. Yes. So I'm sorry we have to close at this point, but we're going to come back in a few minutes, and we're going to look at refuting atheism. Shukran.